We're now joined by writer, producer, director and documentary filmmaker Ami Horowitz, who is in New York. Ami, thank you for joining us. Tell us about this Brett Kavanaugh shenanigans this week. It really was a disgraceful hit job that unravelled very quickly.
Well, no, thanks for having me. It's always a pleasure to be back, guys. This is another example of the media gone wild, the Trump derangement syndrome you guys are talking about. Another perfect example. So Brett Kavanaugh, as I don't know if you guys, if your audience knows, but he was a Supreme Court justice, and he went through quite a bit of trouble when he was trying to be nominated by the Supreme Court. And they brought all these allegations and these women who made these unfounded claims against him. In fact, the FBI was brought in to see if there was any truth to these claims, and none was found, not a single shred of corroborating evidence. So he now became Supreme Court justice. Fast forward to the last week, and another claim that came out that essentially saying that he was walking around in some party with his member of parliament out. I don't know what euphemism you guys want to use for this. And by the way, a friend of his took it in his hands and pushed it into a woman's face. Now, it's kind of hard to handle this story delicately. Clearly, his friend did not handle it delicately at all as well. But the point of the matter was that the woman herself, when they found her, had absolutely no recollection of this event happening. Yet, the New York Times, who broke the story, it actually wasn't a new story, it was actually an old story, that the New York Times, who reported on this story again, failed to mention that this woman had absolutely no recollection of this thing happening. And by the way, my guess is if that happened to one of us, we'd remember. And that wasn't even the blockbuster news of what happened. And of course, the New York Times didn't report that either. But the major, massive news from this story was that this woman was threatened by people that if she didn't confirm this story, they would release all this nasty personal history that she had. That, of course, was not reported by anybody until, of course, the whole thing unraveled and blew up in the New York Times face. So, of course, how we have it again, another attempt by the media, an arm of the Democratic Party, in this case in particular, to try to bring down a Supreme Court justice.
And the one witness who saw this alleged weird incident was a Clinton lawyer, wasn't it? It was as the man who represented Bill Clinton when he was accused of exposing himself.
That's correct. Of course. Do you think that was mentioned by the New York Times? No, of course not.
Oh, my goodness. Now, our PM has also been in the US this week. Obviously, we've had great coverage of it in this country. What's the reception he's had from the US media? Give us an insight there.
Well, I mean, I don't want to make you guys feel bad, but he's been kind of overshadowed by all this news coming out with Kavanaugh and Ukraine and so forth and so on. So I got to be honest, we don't spend a whole lot of time thinking about Scott Morrison, but I will say the president has received him very warmly. The president, and, you know, look, there's a lot of aligning between Scott Morrison and his administration and the president's policies and what his objectives when it comes to, certainly when it comes to China, they seem very aligned. Obviously, when it comes to trying to curb illegal immigration to both our countries, they're certainly aligned. When it comes to Israel, they're aligned. So the president certainly received him warmly. I got to be honest, the entire media reaction to him coming was the fact they dined al fresco outside for a state dinner instead of inside where they normally have the state dinners. That was, I hate to say it, all they kind of talked about when it came to the prime minister.
Well,
I don't want you guys make you feel bad.
We just posted up a glorious image that Donald Trump shared on Instagram of the Prime Minister and First Lady and Donald Trump and Melania. And so certainly Donald Trump's given this a lot of coverage on his social media platforms.
Yeah, I mean, Mark Latham here. We don't feel too bad about our place in the world realistically because Henry Kissinger once said in Australia when he was visiting here that when he looks in the mirror of a morning to do his shaving and he brushes his teeth, he doesn't think of Australia necessarily. So I assume that's always the standard in the United States. But on a bigger...
I do. Don't get me wrong.
Do?
I do think about it.
Good on you. You're a good man. But on a bigger issue, do you find it strange that the core message of Trump's foreign policy, a very important message that should be understood around the world, seems to be a source of denial in so many nations, that Trump's saying that the US, under his administration, doesn't believe in foreign invasions, ground wars that can't be won, no longer operating as the global policeman, and other nations, most notably NATO, but also Australia, need to do more to fund and organise their own defence budget?
Yeah, what a horrific, terrible concept that countries should pay to defend themselves. It's a bizarre concept that nobody seems to fully understand, and they can't seem to grapple with it. But, you know, you can't win. Either America is too interventionist and we're the bullies around the world, or you say we want to take a step back and let people handle their own business, and all of a sudden we're isolationists. We can't win with the world. I don't know what we're supposed to do.
Yeah, but Trump's right, though, isn't he? I mean, this is the time for the US to step back, recognise the failures of Vietnam and Iraq, expect other countries to fund more of their own defence, and for the United States to look after its own problems.
No, I agree in the sense that we want to encourage countries to pay and to defend themselves, particularly NATO, who, you know, famously has spent all their money on their social programs and now their military, and we were essentially subsidizing those social programs. I do think the world needs a strong U.S. The world does need an activist U.S. to be involved. I don't think we should be taking a step back in the sense of saying we let you to your own devices. I think our moral leadership, our military leadership is necessary, but we do not want to be stuck in quagmires. That's why he's been trying to separate ourselves from Afghanistan and Iraq. I think that's important. But we do need a strong activist U.S. across the world. I do think that's important.
But, Ami, what's the feeling on the ground? Particularly, I could imagine what the feeling is in New York over the possibility of going to war with Iran. But generally, across America, what's the feeling in terms of the words that have been uttered by the president, given the fact that Iran has done its best to try and bring on a war?
I think people are generally supportive. I think they see Iran as the negative player in the world stage that it in fact is. Although, on the other hand, Americans don't spend a whole lot of time thinking about foreign policy. You don't see a groundswell of people in the U.S. outside of the coast kind of really obsessing about Iran at all, to be frank. So you don't see that as kind of a temperature-raising or inciting issue because we're really more worried about bread and butter issues, the economy, making sure that stays strong. It's really more of an obsession on the coast because they're looking and they're trying to do whatever they can to denigrate President Trump by pointing and painting him as a warmonger. So it's not really been a major issue, frankly, here across most of the U.S.
Well, yeah, did see a poll that said, I think it was 13 or 14% of Americans were in favour of the U.S. going to war over the Saudi issue with Iran and Yemen, which was interesting. There doesn't seem to be an appetite to get involved in these overseas conflicts that cost billions and cost US lives. Now, I wanted to ask you about something entirely different. This restrictions on government funds for colleges that promote anti-Israel teachings or propaganda, you might call it. Tell us a little bit about that.
I'm glad you asked. I was actually here when I shot the video that incited this entire thing. So if you guys remember last time, a couple times I was here ago, I essentially was able to capture open anti-Semitism at a major conference that Duke and UNC, University of North Carolina, were jointly holding. And that created a massive uproar here in the U.S. And in fact, it ignited a congressional and Department of Education investigation. Now, it was just reported on the front page of the New York Times, yes, thank you very much, that the probe was actually widened because the problem we have with our campuses is they're extraordinarily anti-Israel. And they don't give fair amount of time to both sides by any stretch of the imagination. In fact, all they do is attack Israel and bolster the claims of groups like Hamas and Hezbollah and the Palestinian Authority. And the federal government was like, enough of this. You're taking our money to fund these programs. If you're going to do so, you cannot continue to beat the anti-Israel, anti-Semitic drum, not on our dime. And this created a big furor here in the U.S., which resulted in the Washington Post. It was covered by all over the country, and there was a front-page story in the New York Times, to which I take full and total responsibility. Thank you very much.